and we all look forward to your lecture. And now I will request Dr. Sangeeta Desai to introduce the guest. So over to Dr. Sangeeta Desai.
Thank you, Dr. Puttul Sathe. Welcome to the sixth session of the month-long series on gender sensitization and capacity development program organized by the Research Center for Women's Studies in collaboration with UGC. Today's resource person is Dr. Mythri Aleyamma. Dr. Mythri is a postdoctoral fellow at Center for Place, Culture, Politics at Graduate Center, City University of New York. She is also a critical geographer whose interests primarily revolve around migration and urban transformation in contemporary India. She has earned her PhD from the Center for Development Studies in Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala. Building on political economy, radical geography, and ethnographic methods, her doctoral research traces the different types of recruitment of migrants and local Malayali workers that reflect political contests and settlements between trade unions, corporate construction companies, and recruitment agencies. Among her recent publications are two articles, Cards and Careers, Politics of Identification in Kerala, and the second is The Culture Politics of Wages, Ethnography of Construction Worker in Kochi. Today's session will focus on gender and labor questions in COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Mythri, and we look forward for this session. Just a small request to the participants, please do not you unmute your audios and videos so that we can have a great session. Also, after this session is going to be of 40 minutes, and after that you can post your question and answers to the resource person. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Mythri.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Puttul Sathe and Dr. Sangeeta Desai for that generous introduction. I'll just share my PowerPoint here, just a minute. Just a second, huh? Sorry. Yeah. Can you see the PowerPoint?
No, we can't. No, we can't.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, can you see it?
No, we still can't. We have a blurred view of your desktop. I mean, the monitor screen, you know.
Okay. Okay, let me try again, huh?
Yeah. Technology and its challenges.
I know this is the first time I'm doing it,
Don't
and I
worry.
thought I knew how
No,
to do it.
yeah,
Now, hopefully it is,
yeah,
right?
now it has started. Yeah.
Okay, so I
Yeah.
have titled my presentation as Touch and Tech, Labor and the Pandemic Moment. And I want to say this is the question that, frames my thinking here. What is the specific moment in capitalist production process that the pandemic represents, and what are the changes the pandemic has brought into labor and work? And as you know, I'm sitting in Queens in New York, and this is a place that has been ravaged by COVID. And after, and it only took 6 months after I came here for all hell to break loose. So it is in that context. So my presentation today is a little colored by my experience here as well. And as you know, there has been an uprising here, insurrection here against racism, which also arose in the context of the pandemic. So in that sense, I want to connect these two large countries, US and India, in some way. Both are very diverse, both are large and and US has been unprecedentedly affected by the pandemic. So this is what, struck me, what inspired me in terms of thinking about the pandemic and its effect on labor. So this is from when I was booking a ride on Uber once, once the peak was over. I saw this diagram they had given, which kind of felt like as though this service production, where taxi is a service, right? It looked like manufacturing. It looked like commodity production. So you can see rider hotspots and driver hotspots. So these are the places that you are more likely to touch. They call it heavy touch surfaces or high touch surfaces. So this kind of got me to thinking that what is happening here? How are we rethinking each labor process? In fact, each action that we carry out is re-examined in the context of the pandemic, whether it can lead to infection, or how many people are going to meet, how are we meeting. So there is a lot of thought, at least regarding all these labor processes and work processes. So I have, and it's not as though touch based touch. So I actually divide the new ways of organizing work as two kinds. One is touch-based work, that is all the works that involve proximity, indoor collective activities, and or touch. These are the touch-based work, and tech-based works are all that can be performed through a computer screen and doesn't need immediate contact, proximity, or indoor collective spaces. It is not as though touch-based work and tech-based work didn't exist before. We know that a lot of most of the work that we have undertaken, including teaching, social activism, manufacturing, all of this involved us coming together to produce labor, produce commodities. So in that sense, we could even say that capitalism is a collectivization process. And tech-based work also existed, which, for example, high managerial work, which we know that many professors and CEOs and some of the techies in Silicon Valley or in Bangalore, they could afford to go out of the workplace, their immediate workplaces, spend vacation, and also work from home or work remotely. So those options existed, but these were drastically changed in the context of the pandemic, in terms of who has the right to do, tech-based work, who has the right to operate remotely, and whose work is considered essential. So there are these interlaced elements of touch and tech that we see in these work processes. Within industries and sectors, work processes have been divided on the basis of how they can be performed remotely, meaning through a computer screen. For example, teachers, some artists and researchers, some managers and IT workers with minimum contact. For example, delivery workers, shopkeepers, and those that involve extreme proximity and touch. For example, restaurants, care workers, hospital workers, workers in manufacturing, working in the shop floor. The farther you are in this touch tech spectrum, your work is likely to be considered safe or unsafe. These divisions partially captures the divide between essential and non-essential, as well as remote work and on-the-spot work. So touch and tech not necessarily capture all of this dichotomy between essential and non-essential. For example, banking is considered an essential service, but at the same time, the tellers have to perform their activity on the spot. They don't have the luxury of working from home. But at the same time, if you see other supporting staff in the bank, many could work from home. However, within an industry, there could be workers primarily involved in touch-based work, and others could be doing tech-based work. In these new divisions that have emerged among the working classes, the disease is mobilized and used according to the specific context in which the industry or business operates. COVID and the politics of demobilization. So we can see that COVID involved massive demobilization of both workers and productive capacities in the past 3-4 months, but it is unlike a recession or depression. During other times too, labor is constantly demobilized. For example, when there is a recession, or when, for example, wages increase a particular area, businesses might leave that area and relocate their factories elsewhere, or parts of their manufacturing elsewhere. So during other times too, labor is constantly being mobilized and demobilized, but it is on the lines of a spatial fix, where you kind of play around the globe in search of cheap raw materials or cheap labor. What we see now is a different kind of demobilization. Surely the scale is huge, but that is not all. There is the enforcement of a social contract of demobilization. So this is something I want to stress, is that, it seems that there is this enforcement of a social contract of demobilization of productive capacities as well as labor. And it seems different social classes react to this enforcement in their own ways. And if you see the case of US, you might have noticed that, there is this huge resentment against wearing masks, or not sending the children to school. So there is a cultural war around this enforcement of social contract of demobilization. The politics of touch and proximity during the pandemic has a functional role to play in the social contract of demobilization, where workers are informed of their redundancy and superfluity through the medium of the pandemic in terms of the degree of essentialness and safety that the precise work process that they are involved in is invoked. The enforcement of a social contract of demobilization by the state. This is a reworking. So what we see is not an uncontested phenomenon. There are political contests around this enforcement of demobilization, and this has been the most stark in the case of US because the protests around George Floyd, the shooting of and killing of George Floyd, has been also a protest against this demobilization and against the complete withdrawal of state, especially the federal state, from helping people to get through the pandemic. And this contestation and this reworking of the class compromise has racial, caste, and gendered dimensions. So I want to just talk about one or two cases here. And the case of meat processing industry in Utah in US is one. So meat processing industry in the US has been affected both in terms of organizing manufacture as well as very high rates of infection among workers in the industry. So COVID-19 has been a raised experience in the meat processing industry. JBS Beef Hiram, which is part of JBS USA, which in itself is a subsidiary of a Brazilian company, is the largest meat processing company in the world. Despite recent mass testing at the Hiram facility, and in this mass testing of workers in their facility, it was revealed that 28% of JBS workers were tested positive, but the plant continued to operate. So there was no stoppage of the plant because people were affected. Even people who had COVID were asked to come back and work. Most people of color work on the production lines in close proximity to other human workers and animals, while whites are disproportionately concentrated in management positions. This is the situation in this plant, and we'll see how in this particular place COVID has affected each ethnicities. So if you look closely into this chart, you will see that Black or African Americans are only 0.7% of Cache Valley in Utah, but they are 5.99% among the number of COVID cases. And the worst affected in Cache Valley is Hispanics and Latinos. So they are 9.6% of the population, whereas the number of cases, their percentage is 38%. And whites, not Hispanic or Latino, they are 83% of the population, but they are only 20% of the infection rates. So what this shows is two things: that it's a very racially divided story in the US, but also that such disaggregated data is available in us even in a state like Utah, which we don't have in India. So this is like the caste census, or this is how a caste census of COVID cases would look like in India, which is not available at the moment as far as I understand. Another dimension of it is that how different communities react to and how different communities are affected by COVID, especially in the global South. So this is largely from this recent article by Gautam Bhan and Abdul Simon Malik. So they say that that they challenge the narrative of this disruption that COVID is. So many Western theorists and philosophers have been very vocal in pointing out that COVID is a portal, or COVID is something that is opening up new opportunities, or it is that it's a kind of disruption or stoppage. But they desist from such dramatic thinking about COVID and point out that structures of inequality that now bear both the new imprint of COVID-19 while holding the continuities of older forms of distancing and exclusion. And so they are saying that what you see is not just disruption, but a continuity and intensification. So life worlds that cannot be so clearly divided into before and after the pandemic, and where crisis and the everyday are not so neatly separable. So they are pointing out that, there is COVID-19 doesn't represent a massive disruption, but it is both a disruption and a continuity. There has been long, and so they also point out that, this work from home or working remotely, these things are contested in the context of the global south. There has been a long unsettled relationship between the categories of home and work, between private and public space, even of who and what the family or the household is. So they are pointing out that, if you cannot even demarcate where home and work ends, this is not just true of global south, but also true of, many women workers. So this clear demarcation of private and public space itself is quite a restricted way of looking at COVID and its impact. And we should also not forget that different regions within nations display different ways of engaging with the disease. And this is true of India as well as the US, where New York, if you see, was quite affected, but at the same time, there was a daily update, there was a daily engagement with the disease. Whereas, for example, that chart that I showed of Utah, that was deleted within 2 days because that information was explosive. So in terms of letting out information, in terms of many base, for example, if you look at New York, there was a moratorium on rent. So people, if they didn't want to pay rent, or if they could prove that they have COVID, they didn't have to pay rent. So but at the same time, this was not available in many states like Florida and several other southern states. So there were these differential processes that were at play, and the question of federalism also came up. And as we know, in India too, there were these differences between Kerala and Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh in terms of dealing with these things. And we have Ashwini Deshpande's work here, who points out that caste and gender have a significant impact in terms of how unemployment is playing out in the post-COVID time. So she points out that women who were employed in the pre-lockdown phase were 23.5% less likely to be employed in the post-lockdown phase. And she also points out that the lockdown had a differential effect on caste groups, as well as in that it affected the employment status of OBCs, SCs, and STs more adversely than it did for upper caste. And significantly, the exodus of migrants from the cities and small towns also points to this deficit in citizenship that we have in India. Not only that, it suddenly brought alive the relationship between rural areas and towns and small towns and metropolitan cities. And it also told us what a fractured territory India is, and that still our citizenship rights are quite tied to an ethno-linguistic identity, which is why you saw a lot of lakhs and lakhs of workers leaving even a state like Kerala, where there was said to be more rights for migrant workers. So at the end of the day, what the state and the social workers and the NGOs were reduced to doing were arranging trains so that migrant workers can leave. So even the most progressive of political activists had to engage in facilitating this exodus because people wanted to leave. And this fractured nature and this ethno-linguistic character of citizenship in India is quite stark in the context of COVID. And this brings to our attention what is capital doing during the pandemic, which I have not really fleshed out, but here are some basic, like some preliminary thoughts on how capital is working out this crisis. It would be a mistake to ascribe any intention or agency to capital as a class in initiating this demobilization. Just as the working class have been divided into touch and tech, essential and non-essential, or remote and on the spot, capital has been fragmented like never before. Its interests are no more being served by the generalized exchange system and state support. So this is in some way how this moment is different from a normal recession or depression. For example, recession demands that capital, especially the banking sector and small businesses, etc., are bailed out by the state. For example, state should pump money into the system so that people are not, the effect on people are minimized by helping capital. Whereas in the case of depression, what we have seen in the 1930s and 20s is that the state had to jump in and create social infrastructure to tide over the crisis. But none of this is the case in the current moment, where the fragmentation that capital is being confronted right now is again one that involves a question of scale and its continued viability as an interest group with the state, viability as an interest group with the state, where different sections of capital could coexist even as processes of centralization and fragmentation are governed by the rules of the market and class struggle. So it seems that the normal cycles of centralization and fragmentation that weeds out small capital or unviable capital is also not happening in the way of the market. Instead, what we see is that tech-focused companies gaining further ground over manufacturing and their centralization tendencies exceeding and destabilizing the viability of capital as a class. These are some tentative thoughts on capital, because I feel that sometimes we forget to look at what capital is doing, because we know that many of them got away with a lot of money from the share market in the past 3-4 months, but we don't know the concrete processes that are going into it. So the question is, are there commonalities that we can trace in these differing experiences of COVID-19? I think this is a question that we can ask in terms of, are there commonalities across regions and across countries? Because this seems to be a moment not only of difference, but also of some kind of collective experience of trauma. The inability to participate. So I feel that the inability to participate in collective consumption practices have the ability to bring relations of production in sharp relief. The abstractions that are required to live through everyday life in a capitalist society is broken down as the phantasmagoria of daily life disappears or is restricted by rules of touch and proximity. So there is, in a way, that, you know, that unites even the rich and the poor. It's not in terms of consumption itself, but in participating consumption in a collective manner. So that somehow breaks down a kind of fetishization of commodities, fetishization of a performative consumption. The semblance of collective life through abstraction that capital enforces is broken down and leaves its imprint on people's mind. So these are some thoughts in a kind of, in a very abstract kind of manner. I hope you have, you know, I was able to kind of at least inspire you to think a little bit in terms of a broad canvas, which is what I've tried. Yeah, I would like to hear from you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mythri, because you have really made us think of how we have contextualized work, the question of the state responsibility, because the state has absolved of its responsibility that we see in US, but in India also we think that the state has absolved. But thanks for bringing in this point. And COVID-19 has also brought out the already existing race and ethnic inequality. And in India, I think the caste inequality also. And the capital is fragmented, as you say, and undoubtedly so. Thank you so much for these points. Let's see if we have any questions from our participants. No, as of now, I don't see any questions from the participants.
So Sangeeta, we can invite people to question. I mean, they can, you know, they can raise, or they can ask
Okay.
Mythri. We can invite the participants to ask their, or to raise questions.
Yes.
Yeah, there is one question.
Yeah.
Can we see? Yeah.
Yeah, Mythri, there is a question from Prachi. She wants to know, can we say that the pandemic has also made us realize that how society has got into deep consumerism? And what do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's, you cannot say everybody is into consumerism, because we know that people don't have enough to eat. You know, they don't have, but at the same time, everybody shares the worry that, you know, will the supply chain break? So more than the poor, I think it shook the rich for a brief while, or the middle class for a brief while, where they thought that, oh, will the supply chain break? Which meant that, will the food be produced? If it is produced, will it be harvested? Who will harvest it? If it is harvested, how will it be transported? And if it is transported, will it reach here or will it go elsewhere? So these kind of thoughts were, you know, circulating in people's mind. I think that is great, because otherwise what we see is that we keep talking about ethical consumerism, you know, especially among among the left in, or the white left in the US, or the upper caste left in India, consumerism is always thought in terms of ethics, but it's never talked about in terms of scarcity, that even if you have money, whether you will be able to buy it, do you want to go to the shopping place? If the Amazon has closed all its delivery options for you, what are you going to do? So that, I think, was a very valuable moment, and hopefully that will have a, and but it's not a lasting moment, but it teaches us about, you know, these processes a lot.
Okay. Megha Tomar, she wants to know how COVID-19 has impacted the ethno-linguistic nature of India. Would you share some light?
Yeah, I mean, citizenship is in India is invested in the state, the substantive citizenship. Formally, we know that, you know, we are all citizens of India, or, you know, we are bound by the constitution, but the actual substantive rights are quite dependent on the federal government, I mean, on the state governments. So it depends on where you're from, basically, or where your origins are, or where you vote usually. So in that sense, it's quite connected to belonging. And I think this is a big difference between the US and India. Both have a federal system, both are unions and federations. But in India, it's formally, our federal system is not as powerful as the US system, because here states can, that, which is why Trump, even though he withheld a lot of help, he couldn't really completely defeat the states that he hated. For example, New York is a state run by the Democrats. But even though he withheld a lot of things during the peak time, they could not defeat it, partially because New York is also very rich, but also because as states, they have a lot of power. Whereas in India, Indian states don't have that much power to uh, stand up to the central government. But at the same time, as you pointed out, this citizenship that is invested, and that is there in the states, is also very, very restrictive in nature, that, you know, it won't include people. For example, a state like Kerala won't include migrant workers in multiple ways. For example, they pay very high rents when they stay. uh, for example, they pay 600 to 700 rupees for a room that they will be sharing with 10 to 12 people. And unions, they don't get union membership at all. In none of the mainstream unions will include them. And they are constantly policed by the panchayat. All kinds of democratic institutions are there to actually police them and harass them in a state like Kerala. There are very minimal rights. I mean, Kerala is supposedly one of the better states in terms of at least ensuring that, you know, there are some protections, but even those are not given as rights, not given as though they are equal Indian citizens, but as secondary citizens, as people who are supposed to be guests. For example, Kerala calls migrant workers guest workers, and guest workers is a term that is uh, reserved for international migrants in other parts of the world. But we call people from other parts of India as guest workers. So in that sense, our citizenship is quite restrictive and quite ethnically bounded and territorially bounded. And it also shows this interesting character about India, that even though we talk about Hindu nationalism, the actual substantive citizenship rights are not dependent on being part of India, but it is dependent on being part of Kerala or Maharashtra, or, you know, wherever you are from. So that's an interesting character.
I have a question, Mythri. In your presentation, you mentioned about different ethnicities and different races being impacted differently. So the Afro-American or the Hispanics getting impacted more. So what is next in line? Is it the Indian Americans, or is it a gender? Are there any studies which have come out which have mentioned that even the gender has had an impact? So the women losing more jobs, although they have predicted that women are going to, but has it like, is there an imperative data that has come?
I haven't looked very closely at the job situation in the US, but it seems that around 13 million people lost jobs in that window. I think in that March, April, May, there was massive, and those are people who filed for unemployment, officially went and asked for unemployment benefit. So the actual numbers could be even higher, because if you are not given a many people are doing contractual work, right? For example, they might be getting odd jobs. So even those might not be there in that number, but these at least 13 million people had officially asked for unemployment benefit, had registered for unemployment benefit. I don't know how many of them are women. That would be an interesting question. But I feel that it could be a very big number, because women's employment is quite high here, as you would know. So half of them could be women actually, or at least 40 to 50% would be women.
Okay.
It need not be lower, but whether it's more than men is a good question.
Anita wants to know that you brought out the nuances between the certain pockets of US and India. So can you share in commonalities in more depth, especially in the last slide, about inability to participate in collective consumption? So
Yeah.
she wants to know if you could elaborate on it.
Yeah, I feel that it's much more, of course, US system is based on enabling people to consume. And this is mostly done through debt, because it's a highly debt dependent country where people actually consume more than they earn. Because, for example, they'll have a mortgage to give. They might be taking a lot of consumption loans. Students, for example, when they do PhD, they incur almost $40,000 $50,000 a year. So if you are doing PhD for 4 years, 4 into $30,000 is almost like 20,000 2 lakh dollars. So they incur debt by by studying, by trying to own a house, by trying to consume. So in that sense, consumption debt, this is a big part of how US economy and US idea of freedom, or the libertarian values that US represents is actually serviced through debt. So in that sense, when you withhold the opportunity to consume, the opportunity to go to a mall, to go to a shopping center, and go to a theater, or just walk down the street, it's doing window shopping. So this can seem very restrictive. For example, students are saying they don't have the college experience, so they think of college as a consumption, as a place to consume the experience of going to college. So if you withhold that, that's a big I think parts of India is also like that, in the sense you have a very expanded consumer society in significant amounts in India too. So, but I don't know how, but we don't have that much history of consumption. If you see US, this has been going for almost a century, right? The way people are used to a certain type of and a standard of living. So I think, I'm not sure how it is in India.
Okay. Even there is a lot of market and business set up around educational institutions also. So as you said, maybe not to that extent as in the US, but definitely so.
Yeah.
Rajni Nair wants to know if you can elaborate on capital as a class and fragmentation of capital. If you can further elaborate.
Yeah. What I wanted to say is that, let's look at what capital is doing in terms of protecting its interests. As individual capital, for example, there are, if you look at my neighborhood, this is a very white neighborhood with a lot of Polish and Balkan refugees and, migrants from different Balkan countries and Eastern Europe. And there are no malls or anything here. There are no big companies, for example. You won't see any of the big chains in this neighborhood. These are all small, shops, and almost 20 to 30% of them have closed down in the past 2-3 months. And what has survived is the franchisees of these big chains. So McDonald's has survived, but not the corner shop, very predictably. But our question is how these different sections of capital is able to negotiate with the state to survive, and to how they are, for example, if there is a massive protest against Amazon for, monopolizing everything, for, their share prices have skyrocketed, and they have earned, and, this guy is now the only trillionaire, right? Jeff Bezos. So there is massive profits from this situation as well, which is also very unequally distributed among capital. For example, you are manufacturing all these, all this meat, but the profit, the major share of the profit is going towards Amazon, because Amazon is able to distribute this. So there is this new, there are new ways of organizing production, which actually is dependent on these chains of supply. So how are those different sections of capital able to represent itself is a question, not only to the state, but also in the public space.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you so much, Dr. Mythri. I think it was a wonderful session. I don't see any more questions.
No, Sangeeta, there is one question which Nutan has asked. The corruption that operates
yes.
behind closed doors in India,
Yes.
does it operate in the US too?
Yes.
That's it. US, I think definitely must be quite corrupt. I don't know. It must be the but I don't know how corruption is seen in, it's a very culturally bounded, culturally articulated concept, right? For example, in India, if a village officer, demands 10 rupees from us to get a certificate that we legitimately is entitled to, we pay that 10 rupees and complain about corruption. But this large corruption, which is policy corruption, is quite invisible most of the time, unless there are these whistleblowers or, people, reading fine print point out that, okay, this is policy corruption. We don't have any means to know. I feel in the US, probably this low level corruption is totally, it's not very prominent, I feel. So if you want to get a driving license or something that you are entitled to, probably you don't have to pay anything. But at the policy level, at the state bureaucratic large bureaucratic, large bureaucracies being run by corporates, right? The government itself is being run by corporates. Prisons are, for example, run by private companies in many parts of the US. So many things that we are used to seeing in India as public or as government is already quite privatized in the US.
So they would be lobbying for those particular policies favoring those particular companies, the large companies.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And also to kind of get rid of all these social security benefits. For example, this New York governor, while this pandemic was going on, had actually cut down Medicaid. Just as the pandemic was going on and people were dying, they were cutting down state insurance so that, this can be opened up to private insurances. But at the same time, I was quite surprised to see a lot of social security in New York. For example, there was rent moratorium, that you cannot charge rent during the pandemic. There was $1,200 being given every month during the pandemic. Testing had become free after a point. And COVID, even though you don't have insurance, COVID, uh, treatment was free. So in that sense, I was quite surprised that, there are so many things that exist, but in a very, very differentiated way. So many social security, the social security apparatus is still there. It's not completely destroyed. That's what I gathered.
Okay. And Dr. Mangala wants to know what is the situation of migrant laborers in US?
Yeah. I mean, you might have heard of ICE, right? ICE, this immigration surveillance policing system that exists in the US is quite ruthless. So they actually do checking. For example, when the protests were happening and people were being jailed, there was an ICE van, an immigration detention van outside the police stations to pick up immigrants from among the protesters, so that they can be, jailed again. So there is a continuous, hunting down of immigrants and undocumented workers that's going on, especially of immigrants from Mexico and other Latin American countries. They are targeted in a very brutal manner. And second, in terms of wages, also they are discriminated. And you saw in that presentation that those that in that meat industry plant, 80% were non-English speaking immigrant workers. So all of the low paid manufacturing jobs are being done by immigrant workers from outside the country. Immigrant in the sense, not in India, migrant worker means a person who's from other states. But here it means that, you are from outside the country. So yeah, I mean, it's quite, but at the same time, I feel that because the system here is more attuned to interstate migration, there is not that much discrimination of US workers. There is racial discrimination, but there is not much discrimination just because you are coming from a different state.
Okay.
That's what I've understood. But these are all my, impressions.
Sangeeta, there is still one more
One question. Yes. From Facebook, I think Swati Sawant Rane, she wants to know, how do normal people then get justice?
You mean what is the court system and all of that? You saw the normal people. I think it depends on, what kind of normal you are, what is your race, and what is your, mental health situation? Are you homeless? Are you are you brown or black? So these things matter a lot. And also justice itself is this, very punitive, very racialized, a uh, very racial capitalist prison oriented justice system. So everything is like, for example, there is this 3 strikes. So in that sense, I think Indian judiciary, even though it is so scattered and so delayed, but there are certain elements of the US justice system and punitive machinery that's quite intense in terms of its hatred for people, like in terms of its brutality. It's quite, I think, quite a thing in itself. You might want to look at the book by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, her book called Golden Gulag. It's a very interesting work on the Californian prison system. And in California, it is the state owns it. So she demonstrates how the recession in California in the 1970s and the surplus population that was there was actually used by the state to that crisis was solved by building more and more prisons. So prison building is a way to suppress surplus population, a way to actually, jailing people is a way to neutralize political opposition, neutralize, uh, reserve armies of workers.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Mythri. I think you've answered all the questions that the participants had. Dr. Puttul Sathe, now I would request Dr. Puttul Sathe to give her vote of thanks, and maybe if she has any last questions.
Yeah. So Maitri, thank you for that wonderful talk. In fact, I think you have raised so many issues, and especially the flight of capital and the manner in which capital has behaved. Because here in India, you must have seen that, especially in the realm of higher education, the pandemic has been used as a pretext to further certain corporate interest. I think we can all see what is happening here as far as India is concerned, and the whole politics of this online education. So, but this was a very interesting talk, Maitri, and thank you for having raised certain issues. I think that is what is more important. Nonetheless, on behalf of the center, Maitri, in fact, I should say that this I hope is the beginning of a long association. This was the first episode. We would definitely like to invite you in the future so that we can talk about this much more. So thank you